Hello, I'm Brandy Agerbeck of LooseTooth.com, and I help you reclaim drawing as your best thinking tool so you can see and shape your life and your work in new ways. And today I'm so excited to share with you a way that I helped shape the work of an organization, Us Against Alzheimer's, in a meeting that I helped support with my graphic facilitation skills last week here in Chicago. And those who know when I talk about my business, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for me to share my client stories. A whole lot of the work I do when I'm there to visually support all sorts of fantastic different events, so much of that work is internal and proprietary, and I can't really talk about it. But I'm so happy to have been hired by Kelly O'Brien, who is the executive director of the Brain Health Partnership. So this is one of the key initiatives within Us Against Alzheimer's. And she hired me to come support this 3-hour meeting where they convened all sorts of a beautiful room of healthcare professionals. I got a cat playing with a toy over here. Got the mouse. Let me see if I can play fetch and record a video at the same time with my goofus cat. So they were convening this 3-hour meeting, all these different healthcare professionals coming together to talk about the objective was how to get folks, how to get patients to have more conversations about their brain health and to have them younger in their life. And I think for a lot of folks, when you say that big scary word of Alzheimer's, the idea is that it's winning the world's worst lottery, right? That it's just, it happens to some people, it doesn't happen to other people. You know, if your parent had it, you know, woe is you, like it's just sort of like this sense of something to fear until you experience it, or you experience it as being a caregiver for a parent or an older relative. And what I wanted to share in this video was first just some encouraging research, so some content about that meeting from last week, but then I also want to go into depth in that image about some of my visual choices. So for those of you who clicked on this video because it's about Alzheimer's research, I will do that first. And then if you want to stick around for the visual thinking, feel free. I'm happy to have you around. But I just wanted to share this project because not only was it a pleasure to support that group in their work, but also it gives me an opportunity to talk about some of the cognitive functioning I'm doing up here when I'm supporting groups as a visual facilitator. So let me actually hop on over to the image so I can talk to that. And so you should see a drawing that I made. So this drawing was made over the course of that 3-hour meeting last week. And let me talk about some of the pieces of it and how it supported the group and some of the details in it. So I had this prep call with Kelly before the event. We talked about what they were trying to do. And again, the key objective of this meeting was how do we help people who may be patients, but people be more aware of their brain health and how to be more proactive in taking care of that gorgeous organ right up here. So it was about having more conversations and having conversations earlier, because the very encouraging research is that as we get to know more and more about this disease, and know there is not a cure at this point, and know there is not treatment at this point, and we can't say we can prevent it, but the very encouraging research is that they're discovering that you can see markers in the brain younger and younger. Now, you may think, oh, that sounds really scary and that just means it's worse. No, that means that they're getting better at the brain imaging and understanding what they're looking at to be able to see what is the health of your brain at younger ages, and then how can you heal, how can you take care of yourself in ways that can help your brain heal too. Now, again, I will not make any claims that we can prevent it, but there are ways that there's a lot more proactivity than just kind of waiting around, being afraid of this disease, and avoiding doctors, avoiding treatment, all that stuff that I think a lot of us do, because it's like, it just feels like, like I said, the worst lottery you could win. So so very encouraging that they can notice these markers earlier so they can respond to them and treat them earlier. Certainly a much better sense of what are some of the risk factors. So both what are the risk factors and then what are the ways that you can proactively approach your health and improve your brain health overall, and keep your brain healthier for longer, right? So I know I don't have a lot of detail on that here, but some of the things are more research around how much diabetes and high blood pressure are connected with Alzheimer's, higher incidence of Alzheimer's. And what I liked, and you see here in this corner up here, if I can zoom in there, was this idea of there's been different studies, some better constructed than others, some with clearer results than others, but more and more research is showing the connection between vascular health and brain health. So if you're taking care of your heart, in turn, it's helping your brain. And how are those two things related to each other? The key thing I heard there was a lot about weight, a lot about not smoking, certainly about, again, not having high blood pressure, but encouraging research on that front. But a lot of the risk factors are, it's not, again, nothing is a guarantee, but it's about knowing that that we can be more proactive in this. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me personally was realizing, one, that they can see evidence, they can image the brain better and have a better understanding of what's happening than ever. And I'm sure that's only going to get better, right? That they can notice what's happening younger. And also, I didn't know that there's all sorts of ways of measuring cognitive function that aren't memory. I know I'm 45 years old. I forget words, and I see people around me, my age, older, younger, that there's sort of this cultural joke is not quite the right word, but this cultural habit that when you forget a phrase or when you forget a word, that you jump to this conclusion that there's, that you will, you're kind of doomed to this end state. Honestly, I think a massive part of this is we're just overloaded with stuff all the time, right? And there certainly are people who do have memory issues that are connected with, cognitive dysfunction. But I think we tend to, that's where our brain goes, and there's a lot of fear there. But just the fact that there's other aspects of this that aren't just about memory, I don't know what they are. So forgive me for being vague in this video. But I think it's important that it's a bigger picture than just memory. And that the earlier you can talk to folks, talk to different providers about this, instead of coming from a state of fear. So if you look here in this corner, or over here on the left, there's this word bubble that says not asking questions you don't want the answer to. Very, very understandable, that you think that if I don't ask, then I don't know. And then, you're putting off, it's not going to change what's actually happening in that brain tissue. But, I understand that sense of fear. But what's great was there's so much more research about much more knowledge, much better sense of those risk factors that, what I love is just above that is this word bubble that says, no, I want to know, and have these conversations and understand what is my baseline brain health when I'm younger, so that when I'm older, I have a better sense of, how is my cognitive function compare, at age perhaps 35 to age 55, 65, and so forth. And having a better, clearer sense of what the potential outcomes may be, which you see sort of in this cluster just below this very basic heart shape that I have here. And I did not put a lot of the details around risk factors and positive actions because that was on slides in the room. So that was just a choice not to load this drawing with that, because the biggest objective here in this meeting, which you'll see in the general shape of this drawing, is to help it was about brainstorming what are the potential resources people need to be on top of their brain health, both as this patient that we see here in the center and as the professional health provider. And over here on to the side of that professional health provider is a general category. You see these lines, these parallel lines, all sorts of different healthcare professionals, behavioral health professionals, physician's assistants, nurses, primary care physicians, neurologists, oncologists, gerontologists, cardiologists, ologists, emergency department folks who may be the first one to come in and be experiencing and trying to assess somebody with some kind of problem with their cognitive function. At the very bottom is payers, which I know isn't quite in the same category, but a great conversation about, what is the motivation of insurance companies and payers in keeping folks' brains healthy, hopefully preventing a lot bigger issues and more expensive issues down the road, right? And what the reason why this group was convening, or why Us Against Alzheimer's was convening this group, was that, in modern medicine, you have a lot of very siloed folks. Like, here's the person who works with the aging population, the gerontologist. Here's the cardiologist. It's all about the heart. Here's the neurologist. It's all about the nervous system. And so how to help create some kind of protocol, some kind of guidelines across all these different disciplines, all across these different specialties. And of course, for the folks who are general practice folks, kind of the front lines of folks the patients are talking to, how to create some kind of care protocol and assessments, risk calculators. You'll see some of these words on this page, memory tests, all these things that really help encourage the conversation. One thing I did not get on this chart, it was one of those things where I had it kind of bookmarked in my head early on, but it was a pretty specific detail, didn't end up on this chart, was that very disproportionately, that conversation between the patient and the provider is coming from the patient. And very often, the patient is already coming in with feeling some kind of sense of not, their brain isn't functioning as well as they would like, and it's wrapped up in fear and it's causing stress. And it's a difficult conversation to have, because usually it's coming later in life and at a point where they're starting to see those symptoms, versus, again, earlier, younger, and again, this bigger sense of what your baseline is, your brain health is at a younger age. Disproportionate. It was something like, oh gosh, 5 to 1, something to that kind of rough proportion, that it's brought up in conversation from the patient, not the provider. And I think part of this is the silo of medical practice. Again, this is my words, not the words of the professionals in the room. But really surprising how much that brain health conversation is initiated by the patient, not the provider. And of course, those providers were in that room because they wanted to talk about how to encourage it on the provider side, how to give very clear, up-to-date, current research to create some kind of assessment that is very easy to administer. One of the biggest factors, one of the biggest challenges to all of this is right over the shoulder of the provider here. That little time clock is time demands. Think about how short these appointments are here, of course, and, well, not of course, but here in America, appointment times get shorter and shorter and shorter because folks are, given the system, encouraged to have shorter appointments, get through more patients, all that kind of stuff. So how do you have the most positive, proactive impact when it comes to brain health in that short amount of time? Again, this was a first meeting, hopefully the first of many. So it's not as if they could, solve everything in these 3 hours. But what they did was they came up with lots of different components, lots of different factors, and what makes this a complex situation. Those are my favorite. I love those, big complex conversations. I think they're so important to have. And I love being there to help support those conversations. But what they wanted to do is start brainstorming about some of those potential resources. And in this particular drawing, I'll go more into the visual details, but here, if you look at this, you've got everything that's in that great bright fuchsia pink is resources. And that's because we've got this beautiful pink color up here in the corner in the Brain Health Partnership logo, and that is the focus color for this specific initiative within the organization Us Against Alzheimer's. So throughout this drawing, you'll see different resources that are both available. So here, you've got this solid star. So there are things that are available and can be culled and curated and disseminated to both patients and providers. And then here with the dotted line, you've got things that are needed, and there's plenty that's still needed. I think the biggest thing is certainly all these sort of discrepancies and lack of inclusion around the data. So women are twice as likely to get Alzheimer's than men. And also people of color have much higher levels than, especially Latinx and African American. There is very little data on Asian and East Asian populations. And So, a big thing, a huge thing that's needed is much bigger sample sizes that include different populations. And I like this here, this detail around, better research across races and genders. And I've very simply created these gender circles and these sort of Muppet colored, not skin colored, but kind of Muppet colored circles to represent these different populations. That's important to know, important to have large enough sample sizes to have these folks represented. And I like this idea of better understanding what are the similarities between a Caucasian person and an African American person with the same diagnosis, and what are the differences, so we can better understand the disease in these different populations and how to best respond to those differences. So, it's not a one size fits all kind of scenario. And so I just want to say, one thing was very interesting, I didn't know this personally. Here you've got this idea of memory tests. One thing that this group would love to help lead, it sounds like, this is my extrapolation from the meeting, is very clear, consistent memory tests, but you got to design something different for men than from women. I think if I remember correctly, they said that women are, with the verbal skills, it's easier for them to game a cognitive function test than men. So you have to design them differently so that, you make sure you really understand what is that picture of that person's brain health, through the lens of that memory test. Um, so, again, interesting differences that there's more and more research, which is fantastic. But, I think a lot of it is understanding if you're a woman, you're twice as likely to get Alzheimer's. If you're a person of color, those numbers are even higher. And to have those conversations and not, I know plenty of folks, that's a very difficult thing, is to advocate for yourself as a patient. But what I like is that this conversation, as you can see from these two folks in the center, it was both about how can a patient or a consumer be more proactive in their own health and ask those questions and know what to ask. Things like self-assessments. Over here on the left side here, we had, what if there was a way to pre-screen for cognitive function in the waiting room, and then you could go in and, initiate that conversation with your provider if you had concern about how your assessment went. And then, of course, the other side of the equation being the providers. A lot of this was about having standard protocols, definitely having the research curated, be up to date, relevant and up to date, because it's so hard to keep up with everything that's going on, especially when you got this much time, right? Especially if it's not your specialty. But what I liked about what I appreciated many things about the conversation, but that it was really coming from both the patient side and the provider side, that it isn't just all one side or the other. It really is about all of us, again, taking that more proactive step in our brain health. So before I go into the the more visual thinking choices about how I designed, the choices I made between, this conversation and this piece of paper, this digital image you now see, just generally, I want to, just encourage folks to have the conversations. I know that's exactly what they were having this meeting for. I felt like, and again, I'm no expert. This is all secondhand, excuse me, that don't let the fear take away an opportunity to take care of your brain health. Have those conversations with your doctor, bring up these issues now. And I will tell you, as a patient, you're going to do this, and a whole lot of providers aren't really going to know what to do yet, right? Because of all these issues about time, about resources, about having very clear standard guidelines or protocols to go by. But I do want to encourage you to not feel like this is, like I said, that worst lottery you could win, and um, how little agency you have in taking care of your brain health. Things like weight, things like exercise, nutrition, like I said, about diabetes, and higher, what is the high blood pressure. Certainly smoking is not good. I mean, we know that, but there are things that, like stress, huge factor. One of the patient advocates who was in the room, she told a story about being in a brain study and meeting a fellow person in the study who, he was a CEO with an extremely stressful life. And they, the brain imaging, they saw damage in his brain from all the stress in his life. And he made big changes in his life. He quit that job, he did other things, all this good stuff, and it changed his brain. And happily imaging is getting better and better and better to make it clearer, seeing exactly what's going on in that gorgeous magical place up there, right? So just again, know that you have more agency than you think, and it is about these very basic lifestyle choices. I think this might be the finally the time that I listen to my nurse practitioner when she says 150 minutes of, heart elevating exercise a week. Like, I'm motivated by this. I fully admit. And they certainly brought up that specific guideline in the workshop, in the meeting. So again, you know, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, learn what you can. Certainly check out Us Against Alzheimer's. I was super impressed by what they were doing and who they brought together. And yeah, so know that, you can take good care of this guy up here, and please do it younger and younger. And, again, so much of this around hormone changes as a teenager for I know women in perimenopause, menopause, I think must have some kind of change later in life, but that was a big aha to me and my own brain fog and my own time of life and, lack of function, which thankfully, whole other video, has gotten better for myself. But it's those kind of things that if you don't know that there are these connections between things like diabetes or high blood pressure or just hormone changes, that all these things are going to change your brain health, you just sit in frustration. And because you're not thinking as clearly as you want to think, that just gets in the way. So ask the questions, advocate for yourself, all that good stuff. It's about as much as detailed as I can say right now. But I just want to say what I got to be that fly on the wall in this specific role. Super encouraging, really, really encouraging. So please, take care of yourself and that gorgeous brain. So now I want to switch over to some of these visual choices. And, when I do talk to clients after an event, not during an event or at the end, people come up and they'll comment on, wow, you were listening so hard and paying so much attention, and look at all this content you got, and those kind of things. Very often my kind of go-to, response is yes. And I hope that, when it's sort of these, your brain's really working hard, my response is, knock wood, I hope that this will keep my brain healthy for a good long time. And it just happened that I was in the room with an expert, and I said that, and she goes, oh, I think you have a very healthy brain. So let's hope she's right. Oh my God, I'd love to see brain imaging. Oh my gosh, that'd be so cool to see my brain. But doing this work, there's all this it's extremely intense, and it's listening, it's watching the dynamics in the room, body language, picking up on the ebb and flow of the conversation. It's certainly capturing specific content, thinking about how do the different pieces fit together, synthesizing, organizing, and getting all of that on a piece of paper using very specific visual choices. Of course, that's what I teach, right? So I've done this work for 23 years at this point, and now I help teach folks how to do this, make these visual choices for themselves to help make meaning of their own work. So let me talk about some of those choices that I made on behalf of these clients. And speaking of, I think of myself, when I have a project, I think of having different, I always talk to the client about their objectives. And I'm usually thinking on two different levels. One is the client level. So why are they bringing people together? What is the function of this event within their organization or within a project? And also, what are the objectives of the participants? Like, what are they there to do? So I'm really capturing the conversation on a couple levels. Now, because I had the great pleasure of talking through this project with Kelly O'Brien, again, the executive director of this specific brain health partnership, I got to talk to her about what her objectives were in this meeting. And again, hopefully this was the first of a series of meetings, but it was bringing folks together and giving them the space to have this conversation about meeting this objective of how to get individuals to have more conversations with their healthcare providers about brain health and how to have them younger, earlier in their lifespan. So that was the big, broad question we were there to ask. Kelly certainly had crafted some specific questions, and we talked about, the kind of the best way to use those. I'm thrilled that, so sometimes what I'll see in a situation, and this wasn't the situation in this meeting, is somebody has a list of questions and they treat it like this list where it's like, okay, now let's answer this, instead of letting the conversation move where it needs to go. That you will get good, you'll get good, rich conversation, even if you haven't ticked off each of those specific questions you may have gone in with. I think it's best to be prepared with those kind of guiding questions, but hold them lightly and see, do you need to come back to one of those questions, but not to, when you sort of feel like, we must hit these 6 questions, then instead of getting this beautiful kind of map like this, you get something that's like much more like this little chunk of information and this little chunk of information here, because it really got to be this rich, complex conversation between, it was about 20 people in the room, 25. It's nice. Can't remember the number offhand, but that sort of size ish. That we have this opportunity to see where the conversation goes and let people's ideas build on each other. I think that's the biggest thing. Instead of sort of, getting a lot less nuance or connection with that, by being constrained by those questions. Anyway. So I went into this knowing that it was a first convening and what they were there to do. Certainly this idea of a lifespan. So we talked about, how do you represent the sense of a lifespan on the chart, but not be so literal that it's like, okay, this is a line and this is this age and this is what happens at this age. Now that may come up in a future meeting. There may be a meeting where they are really defining a protocol, where they suggest at this age do this, at this age do this, at this age use this memory assessment tool. Just examples. But that wasn't where this conversation was at, but we wanted this larger context of a lifespan. So that's where I brought in this light purple, those light purple arrows that you see here in the background. And so it's the meeting started with this big, broad kind of long S shape across the drawing. And you can see there's sort of, it's really light. This actually didn't photograph, it's such a light color, didn't photograph that well given the lighting in the room. But they're arrows that overlap to very broadly represent different phases of life. And normally if I'm doing this kind of left-right timeline, often on the right side, I'll have the arrow just kind of keep going. And this is about life, and it doesn't go on forever. So I stood there in front of that chart and decided, how do I end on the right side of the page? So on the left side of the page, it's very simple. It is a closed shape that sort of connotes birth. And on the right side of the page, it does end, connoting end of life. Without labeling it birth and death or anything like that, but the sense of a lifespan as a finite amount of time with these different parts within it. So that was on the chart. And the next kind of purple thing, I'll talk about the figures in a second, but another way I used that light purple color was to create this idea of different touch points. There's different ways you can connect with providers on mental health or on brain health. And because they kept on talking about creating that there are multiple touch points and they want them to occur earlier and earlier, I made this very light purple shape with the shading, distinctly different than the arrows, which have the same purple color, but they don't have any shading in them. So I'm making different visual choices to show different parts, different types of information within the same drawing. But you can see these circles, that there's a series of them and they're kind of connected by this little thin black dotted line, but they reach out farther and farther to the left of the drawing, earlier and earlier in the lifespan. And that was an opportunity to show the idea of different touch points without getting so literal, as this circle means this circle means this. Now, if I have the opportunity to visually support a meeting down the road, which is about that specific protocol, perhaps I would use those same shapes, but label them specifically. In that case, I'd be taking some of the visual patterns I created for this first meeting and carrying it consistently through subsequent meetings. I would love the opportunity. We will see if that happens. But making those kind of mental choices and then realizing that you've set up patterns, so continue to use those patterns as you go. Now let's talk about the human figures here in the drawing. And this is something, if folks have really scoured my work, you'll see a lot, and that's using these large profile outlined people It's a go-to of mine, and I love it because it puts the human in the conversation. And in this case, I knew that I wanted a patient and a provider facing each other in interaction with each other. Now, because I have this light purple lifespan in the background, I chose to use the dark blue color because they're similar colors. And I also chose to have the figure on the left facing to the right as if they are standing facing into the future on their own lifespan. So instead of looking back. Now, I use this a whole lot because I have this sense in Western culture, left to right, past to present as a progression. Now, certainly if it was a person reflecting, they could be standing and looking towards the past to the left side of the page. But I wanted to make that patient figure again moving from left to right and then the provider facing them. And I did kind of put it generally in the middle. It wasn't that, we weren't encouraging folks to talk about these issues with providers midlife, not necessarily in your seventh or eighth decade, but maybe more like your third or fourth decade. So that's part of the reason it's more in the center of the drawing. But you have these two figures facing each other, and you'll notice they are more feminine figures. That is because in conversation with Kelly before the event, we talked about that 2-to-1 ratio. And I did decide to make the healthcare provider also a more female shape. Now, believe me, I would love to not have the guy on the left look like a guy, because by default, by not having a feminine shape of hair, people read that figure as a man and as a bald man. I see it as an everyman or every person, but again, that's, we've got very, very ingrained senses of how gender is represented. Now, I started with those two figures in the center, and I only added that third figure later when we talked more and more about caregiving, the role of the caregiver. So that got added later. So let me see. Let me hop on over to here. So this second slide, I just want to talk a little bit more about color. And this was the branding sheet that I got directly from Kelly from the organization. I love to ask clients about this. What are the significant colors in the work you're doing? If it is about branding and marketing, what is the brand? If it is about a specific color coding for a project, what are those colors? Now, because I knew that this was convened by this organization, and you can see in the corner up here, Us Against Alzheimer's, their logo, the organization's logo is these two colors, this red and this kind of royal blue color. But this specific group is the Brain Health Partnership Group, which is one of these, what they call impact centers. If you look at this lower row of the yellow, fuchsia, and blue, the middle one is the signature color for the Brain Health Partnership initiative within this bigger organization. So in the logo up here in the corner, you'll see you've got that red color, that blue color, and then that pink color bridging those two sides of kind of this shape that looks a bit like a brain and its two hemispheres. So I'm looking at that. That's giving me tons of visual cues that I want to make sure I integrate. And in this case, because I knew it was a convening by this organization, because I knew it was the kickoff of what hopes to be a bigger project, I definitely wanted to make sure there was a lot of the very clear, solid consistency between the branding and the drawing for the event, because I think it just really helps reinforce us Against Alzheimer's and the Brain Health Partnership as the hosts, as the conveners, as the folks that help all these different people connect. And because this specific initiative, this impact center of the Brain Health Partnership was fuchsia, that is exactly why I made that such a prevalent part of the drawing. I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, I do want to point out, I talked about that light purple color. That is exactly what you see on the right side of that middle row. And this is actually a 20%, like a 20% tint. So like only 20% saturation of that same royal blue color. For me, it's just interesting that I see that first one is it's a little purpley, but it's very much like a royal blue. But then once you get 20% of it here, as that like very light tint, it looks much more purple. Now, I did choose to custom mix this color for this project, for this client. And I love the consistency here, and that color being so light photographed poorly, because I was on a wall in a room where it was more brightly lit on one side than the other. This happens all the time. And so in this particular case, I had to spend more time with the drawing in Photoshop later, but um, yeah, so I chose to make that custom color for that very light color, again, that represents a lifespan and represents the touch points along that lifespan. Now let's look at that fuchsia color. Now here I wanted to really have that be the action color for that action center of the brain health partnership. I wanted this to be all that forward thinking. What can we do as an organization? What can we do as a group of people convening? All these ideas around what resources can be created to help both patient and the provider, and later in the conversation, also the caregiver. So if you look at the broad, if you look at this image broadly, you'll see there's a whole lot of fuchsia pieces. Now, early on, very early on, I made the brain of the patient. I drew the brain of the patient. So we remember that that's present on the page. And then I very early on put in these word bubbles. I love using these overlapping word bubbles as a symbol for conversation. I just had the outlines and there was nothing in the overlap between the two. So you had these shapes, but I had it as sort of like this thing in my back pocket that may be used later. Now, as they talked more about what they were there to talk about, to create, to think about what these resources could be, that's when I added in this, overarching goal of preserving brain health, and then this beautiful title, radiant title of resources. And very early on, I put in these two general categories of available, represented by the solid star, and needed. So a dotted line is sort of like it doesn't exist yet, but we need it. So as general placeholders, that some of this stuff already exists and simply needs to be curated. Some of this stuff needs to be researched and created. And then some of these qualities around those resources, that it's accessible, that it's validated, and that is up to date. So this pink color goes throughout the drawing as we talk about these different components, these different ideas. Like I love, I think one of the most important parts of this chart is that right now there's too small of sample sets, and we do need that better research across races and gender. This shape, the cylinder shape, is a symbol for a database. So that's, you got a big giant, hot pink database up there. So, all of this kind of cluster here is all about research and, who do we need to research, and the fact that, we need better information about what are the similarities and the differences. Here we've got, I mentioned this earlier, this idea of, is it possible to do a self pre-screen in a waiting room before you went to actually meet up with your nurse practitioner, doctor, or physician's assistant? All those great healthcare providers. Caregiver toolkit, how can we give the best information there? I talked about the memory tests and how they're different by gender. But all these pink things are generally different resources that either exist or could be strengthened or need to be created. And yes, generally the ones on the left have to do more about the consumer or the patient, and ones on the right, these ones connected to this doctor figure, have to do more about, have more to do with them and their role. But it wasn't until the very end of the conversation that I added in this bright pink, solid pink shape in that conversation piece, which was the whole idea is we want to make this we want to make this standard operating procedure. We want to make this a part of a normal appointment, that folks talk about what is your brain health. How, are you noticing anything that's different? Is there anything that's concerning you? And you'll notice the visual choice here is this is the only thing in this whole chart where it is solid pink. So you've got some places where I use hatch marks, where I use lines to shade a shape, but this is the only place where it's that solid pink, and your eye zooms in on that. So that's very much by purpose, very much on purpose, to help your eye go back to that idea and reinforce that idea. And of course, it's also, not only are they facing each other and talking to each other, it's in the area of where their eye lines are. So that's something that we as humans, we notice a figure and then we notice where that figure is looking. So these are just some of the visual choices here that I made to make sure I was really supporting that group and what they were doing in that meeting. So I could talk about more little details, but I think that's a pretty good overview. Yeah. So I'm really excited about this project. I'm really thankful for the opportunity and the work that they're doing at Us Against Alzheimer's, and certainly the Brain Health Partnership. Again, I'm excited just to talk about a project, right? Some work I get to do, the work how I get to help support a group. And here, hopefully, you found it useful to hear some of these specific visual choices. So, by all means, I welcome questions, I welcome comments, and I certainly appreciate your time watching this video. And again, wherever you are, take care of this gorgeous brain, your gorgeous brain. Make sure to ask those questions. Your overall health, absolutely tied, your physical health, absolutely tied to that gorgeous organ up there in your skull. So thank you for watching. Again, any questions or comments, I welcome them wherever you are. I hope you're well. Oh, I do have to give a shout out. You know, I do this work professionally, as I did last week. So in that role as a graphic facilitator, I was drawing for the group. I also teach visual thinking. So and I also teach about graphic facilitation. So if you want to learn more about visual thinking, I recommend my book, The Idea Shapers, and also the companion course, The Agrabek Method. So that's all about these visual choices. It's both the book, I think the book makes a great reference, and the online course is this very comprehensive, video-based course about all these different visual choices. How do you shade in different shapes? How do you choose the colors? What does scale mean? I'm using scale all throughout this drawing. Big ideas are big, supporting ideas are smaller. All those different things are broken down in the Agrabek method, that online course all about visual thinking. And then professionally as a graphic facilitator, I already have out a course called Graphic Facilitator Confidential. That's about the business side. One part of which is about that prep call with the client, like I talked a little bit in this video. And launching on January 1st is Gold Star Graphic Facilitation, which is all about the work itself in the room. By all means, I hope you'll check out other videos. I hope you'll sign up for my newsletter. And, I'm always here to make visual thinking resources for you, again, to help you reclaim drawing as your best thinking tool. And I certainly appreciate you watching. And I think I said what I need to say. So I'm going to rest this brain. I'm going to rest this voice. And I will see you next time. Thanks so much.